This video is about character design, like almost every other video on this channel, but more specifically, how to create a character design that begets its own character designs. Trippy, right? But first, let's talk about sandwiches. So let's say you're walking into Subway, or no, how about Jersey Mike's? Yeah, let's go with that. Sorry to everyone outside the States who has no idea what I'm talking about. There are few things with an allure as potent as that of customizing something so that it reflects a part of your soul. We love to express individuality and identity, even within the frameworks of something that's otherwise rigid. So you walk into Jersey Mike's and you order your, say, standard veggie-only Italian sub on a gluten-free bun. Don't make fun of my stomach. You have now designed this sandwich. Everything on this sandwich is there because you chose it to be there, right? You may have selected from available options based on your own preference to arrive at something not already on the menu, but ultimately, first, you aren't even the person who put the sandwich together. There was someone trained, they're sometimes called sandwich artists, I guess, and second, those ingredients they're using aren't even something you made available either. It was something that was prepared off-site or at a different time. Are they even the ones making the bread? Maybe baking it, but not necessarily kneading the dough. Third, you're selecting from an available system of sandwich making options. You can't just decide that you want lobster, although that's probably a bad example. I'm sure Subway's done lobster for some reason before. They would be the place with the guts to put refrigerated lobster on any old sandwich. So you can't decide that you just want pasta or pomegranate on your sandwich, as weird as that would be, because it's not available within the system. In the end, maybe you didn't point at the board and say, "Give me a number 4, I trust you." But did you design that sandwich? Well, for the next 98 minutes, no, you didn't. You customized a sandwich based on available options. So when it comes to character design, we're talking today about systems where you can create and customize lots of characters from a specific base. How exactly do you make it so that potentially millions of people in your mass-produced thing have enough tools at their disposal so that they feel as though they have successfully personalized something, or that it reflects their identity despite those tools essentially being available to everyone else? Or how do you use the same shapes or basic structure of something but make it feel unique? So if I asked you to make me a toy, just one, based off of one character, you'd probably go about doing it in whatever way feels intuitive. You sculpt it, you work from reference. Most of us aren't toy makers, but we'd probably come up with something. What if I asked you, though, to make 100 different toys, each based off of a different character? What about 1,000? Unless you somehow had unlimited time and resources, most likely you'd start looking for ways to be more efficient. Are there parts of the process that can be repeated across all of them? We talk about character design a ton on a channel called Character Design Forge, but often it's about the specifics, the Mario, the Mickey Mouse, the individual characters for specific purposes and stories. This video is one I've been wanting to make for years, though, because on the other hand, it covers a wide variety of examples through different mediums and formats. One thing unites all of them, though. There's a base, a default, a starting point that can be repeated over and over. So what makes a good base? And at the end, can we make one ourselves? One that other artists, like perhaps even yourself, could use. Real quick, no sponsor, I just wanted to tell you that my wife Tay has put a tremendous amount of work into relaunching a new, beautiful shop over at brookeseggleston.com/shop, where, as you have been requesting, you can finally get items like pins, cards, stickers, and the like from previous years of Biko's backpack, both in themed packs, but also, as you've been requesting, individually. So make sure to check that out, and there might even be a new item in that shop by the end of this video, if everything goes well. So first of all, talking about that efficiency, there's kind of one big factor that plays into almost all character bases, and that's 2D easy, 3D hard. Not only is this true on an individual level, it's way easier for us to draw a picture or make some marks on a piece of paper than it is for us to accurately sculpt something in 3D, whether that's digitally or in clay. Not only do more people on average have the ability to draw than to fabricate or sculpt, but in the games and animation industry, we tend to make concept art in 2D first because that iteration is just way faster. But scale up now to making something over and over. It's way easier and faster to print something on paper than it is to 3D print something. Replicating and copying something 2D is easier. Making a 2D change on something printed is as simple as changing what graphic you're using, but changing something in 3D means modifying the mold or whatever's being used. 2D easy, 3D hard comes into play throughout our entire look at base characters and customizable characters. So let's take things back to one of the most successful character bases, one that's been used continuously for over 40 years. It's the LEGO minifigure. LEGO changed quite a bit starting out. You can probably find more definitive histories on that subject.
But at least now it can't get much worse.
But it did get worse.
But the minifigures as we know it today, with very little change, came out about 40 years ago. The selection of minifigures was fairly small for the first few years. You had spacemen, knights, policemen, townsfolk, all very nicely and simply designed with this clean and iconic graphical style that still maintains today. As the years have gone on, their level of quality and affinity for new figures has shot up, as well as tons of licenses where existing characters have been remade, leading to now thousands and thousands of unique LEGO minifigures. So there's lots of custom parts like molded heads, short legs, hook hands, and things like that, but a blank LEGO minifigure, the default one, looks like this. It really doesn't change much from here. The customization largely comes from changing the color of these plastics and from the 2D graphics that are printed on these. So from what I can gather is still the current process for LEGO, the plastic pieces are injection molded, so that requires these incredibly high quality metal molds that can last for thousands of uses, and tampo printing, which is where a pad picks up the ink to be printed and wraps around and stamps the sometimes non-flat surface, like these heads. For LEGO, the logistical cost of creating a new 3D LEGO piece far outweighs the cost to create a new 2D printed graphic. This solution has made it so all minifigure scale sets are compatible with one another and are using the same base.
System? There isn't any system.
But what this also means is that all of these figures are compatible with each other, with very few exceptions, which means kids can swap bodies around, people can create their own identity with what are called sig figs, and creativity can thrive within an incredibly well-designed system. The highly technical engineering and thought that's gone into minifigures may seem boring or obvious or antithetical to spontaneous fun, and yet it's made it so minifigures released decades ago or today, the minifigures that you have or that I have, are all compatible. So while again we usually focus on individual designs, and yes, there's some great looking and then also less great looking minifigures, what a great character design system. A big part of our overall base character concept here is an inherent principle of character design, which is that shape is actually pretty elastic, meaning that of course there are correct shapes and proportions of something canonically, but in terms of what we can recognize in a stylized sense, there's actually a lot that you can get away with. For example, think about the Stormtrooper from Star Wars. You probably know pretty decently what that looks like, right? And yet, look at these sketches by Nathan JP on Instagram. The shapes being used are wildly different, but the iconography of stormtroopers being applied to them makes them recognizable. The features of the helmet, the armor, this happens with LEGO figures, for example. Here are the silhouettes of a ton of iconic characters, and here are their LEGO minifigures. Most of them have unique head sculpts, which does help with the shape, but all of them have the same body. The elasticity of their shapes and the 2D graphics help us recognize who they are. They aren't an accurate one-to-one translation of the character, but it does the job. And being able to use most of the standard minifigure parts makes it possible for LEGO to crank all of these out. Let's leave for a minute though. Let's get out of the physical realms of reality and talk about the future of 2006. It's time to see that 2D easy, 3D hard is just the same in the digital world. I know that for me, thanks to some hard work and effort put in by my mom, I had a Nintendo Wii relatively early on, despite it being a really popular item back when it released, and because of that, I spent a lot of time sharing it with new people who were big gamers, but also older relatives that had never played a video game. The core Wii experience then was to try the motion controls in Wii Sports, and you can't play Wii Sports without creating your own Mii. Thomas Game Docs has a really in-depth look at the history of the Miis and attempts that Miyamoto had made early on in Nintendo's consoles. Mario Paint or Mario Create on the N64 disk drive had a relatively in-depth set of character creation tools, but it wasn't until they pulled back on trying to make the most technically advanced character creator they could that they landed on a concept based both on kokeshi dolls, simple wooden figures with spherical bodies, and a riff on a Japanese game where people pinned facial features on a blank face, a little like pin the tail on the donkey. A lot of the initial facial features made it easy to create a person with Japanese features, obviously, but the developers studied a lot of different faces from around the world to make it so that the Mii's library of features would allow more people to be covered and represented. The Mii channel is incredibly simple, but it was actually pretty revolutionary at the time. The fact that a simple avatar of yourself that you made could actually populate a game, and you might even see your uncle, or Kermit the Frog, or a burger walking around in the background. Yeah, that was huge. So much so that Microsoft pretty quickly joined in with the avatars, and I think there was PlayStation Home, which wasn't quite the same. The Wii was a really big deal, and Miis were part of it. So you have a relatively low-powered GameCube 2 with an avatar creation system. How'd they do it from a character creation standpoint? Well, looking at it now, it's deceptively simple. You have a uniform body, you could give your Mii a skirt or pants, the height, and I guess you could call it the girth, were adjustable, and the head shape could be adjusted. I'm sure those were multiple 3D models that were being swapped out. And a note too about 3D. 3D models are made up of polygons, usually triangles in games, and for a computer, or specifically game console, to display them, especially adjust them, inherently takes more power than 2D images. 2D, easy. You can load textures, sprites, and images and modify and display them easier than 3D, which comes in handy when you are birthing new life from the Mii channel. From the technical side, too, you have a lot of limitations. For one thing, there was a feature that allowed you to load a Mii onto the Wii Remote and bring it with you. That means that the total file size of the Mii had to be incredibly small, which meant that they couldn't make a limitless amount of facial features available. It would just take up too much room. Before you even got into Wii Sports, the Mii creation process was especially entertaining. You could do like the whole, whoa, that person's eyes aren't really that up high, or they're not that short. Giggles abounded. A lot of that was due to a really tactile system. Most of the 2D graphics that represented noses, eyes, mouths, and facial hair could be moved, scaled, rotated, and skewed. I think, though, that the outcome of each person's Miis kind of varied. Some people were just a little harder to capture the essence of, and some people wanted to have like such a flattering representation of themselves that it came off standard and bland. For me, I like to go like full-on caricature, even past what's already exaggerated. The genius of it, though, was that you could create a personalized character that existed within the recognizable aesthetic quality of the Miis, and they did this by creating a library of features that were personal, felt unlimited, and gave you something that you could integrate into games like Wii Sports, Wii Play, Mario Kart, the Rate Me channel, Wii Music. Alright, that's quite enough. Later Nintendo consoles and games added more to the Miis. The Wii U added a few more facial options and had a feature where you could create a Mii from a photo that was a little not consistent. The Street Pass Miis on the 3DS could get little Nintendo hats. How nice. And then by the time of Miitopia on the Switch, people went all the way off with a Mii editor that was essentially like a low-rent vector art creator, and the possibilities basically went beyond the limits of a simple library of features into an image editor. From a character design standpoint, though, I think what Miis achieve is similar to those LEGO minifigures, because no matter what person you created, they were still distinctly Miis. And I think in a way it's a bit of having the cake of customization with the eating it too of being an iconic Nintendo character for Nintendo. The way you arrive at that is with a design language and set of systems that is uniform, consistent, and recognizable. It may have been impossible for the designers to anticipate every possible combination of Mii features, but they made those features simple, unified, and distinctive. So for our next base characters, it's actually time to start at one of the nearest and dearest parts of toy culture for me from the last few decades, that ultimately resulted in what I would be so bold as to call the bane of the toy industry. If you know, you already know, it should be fairly easy to connect the dots. There's a pretty big umbrella cast over what you might call designer toys or urban vinyl, and that's because it isn't monolithic, like almost anything that's driven by a large community. Designer toys and art toys overall are not a necessarily new thing, but there was a certain cultural peak it was reaching in the mid to late 2000s. Essentially, this was anything from modified and customized toys, sculpted and bespoke toys, limited runs, blind boxes, and urban vinyl in particular. In the epicenter of this art was a little like graffiti and punk and counterculture all rolled into one. Yes, I know that two of those things are the third thing. There were artists like Joe Ledbetter, Cause, Bearbrick, Tokidoki, all translating at the least a parody of the establishment, but at their best a deeply personal, dynamic, and unique piece of art that oftentimes was replicated like a toy in small runs so that you could own it yourself. There were plenty of people and companies before, and still some now, but I think the peak of this part of the zeitgeist is something you can sum up with Kid Robot, specifically the kinds of things that they were doing in the late 2000s. Heroes of Burger Town, the Labbit, and probably most famously the Dunny and Money World variants. These were bases that were not only customized by individual artists and made for sale, but also sold as blanks. The monies were, not necessarily the Dunnies, but people would just kind of spray paint or sand those down. This was huge because it was bringing the flavor of designer toys and personalization to anyone with a marker or some paint, and you could of course easily modify these guys heavily with clay and things like that. One of Tay and I's dates back in the day was spent making these two guys. Hers, the little ice guy, is way cooler. I think they've taken some damage after 4 moves, but this was awesome. You had the superstar artists within this scene, but then you also had the scene itself spooling up and providing an alternative to just the action figures and dolls you'd find on the shelf at Walmart. Not only was the audience for these largely adults, they were a springboard into art and character design inspiration. At New York Comic Con, which I haven't been to in about 10 years, but about 10 years ago, there were awesome art toys on display. There was Glyos, which is a whole other bag. There was imports of designer toys from Japan. It was just really awesome. You could even meet some of the artists who are making these things one-to-one. While tons of different and unique sculpts for designer toys were available, characters like the Money and Dunny were base characters, like this video. Except their aim wasn't the same as Lego, necessarily to create a perfect neutral or standard to start from. The shapes and ideas that the base designs brought to the table informed the artists who would then customize them. Something about the extreme taper to features like the arms and legs, the exaggerated tilt of the head forward. It was posturing. It was, in a weird little way, dynamically rebellious. It used to be that I'd go down into New York City and visit the Kid Robot store, and then take a short jaunt down to My Plastic Heart, which is actually still in business. I'd like to stop by there again sometime. The Kid Robot store, however, is gone. Kid Robot is still around. The Money is actually surprisingly still available, but a visit to their website will probably be noticeably different now, thanks to a lot of intellectual property. Yeah, see, something has happened in the last decade or so. It's not just the natural transition of counterculture into culture. It's not just that the guy who grew up listening to punk drives a minivan to his 9-to-5 now. Sure, that's a natural progress that's part of what's happened to the life cycle of designer toys, but also that other culture, pop culture. That has a double meaning. For one thing, it should be no surprise to you that since about 2008, there's been a sharp uptick in geek culture, franchising, fandoms, and probably most importantly, nostalgia. How integral has it become, and maybe it was at a fever peak a few years ago, to define oneself by the things that you like, and increasingly the conglomerate media feedback loop of endless regurgitation and stripping out of the house's copper wiring to give the people what they want, and their demands getting louder and louder as monopolization of attention. Theaters, storefronts, conversations, criticisms, snowballs and metabolizes. People's media literacy bottoms out as reboots and sequels, and everything that was even remotely successful in the 80s is given a second shot. Whew. We're swimming in the age of nostalgia. And I mean, I like Star Wars and video games and stuff. I'm not a hermit. So there's that going on. You probably noticed it. And meanwhile, a little company that has a love of cereal mascots from the 60s makes a line of bobbleheads called Wacky Wobblers. They have sculpts that harken back to the style of toy production from the mid-century. They're very cool. This company, who already dabbles in licensing popular IP, now opens a Pandora's box that can probably now never be unopened, and creates a little line of DC superhero figures. They look like this. Do you know where this is going? I think you know part of where this is going, but maybe not all of it. If you've been in a store in the last decade, you know what Funko Pops are. They are uniformly proportioned figures, most of them with soulless black orb eyes that represent almost every character ever to appear on a screen or game or thing or sports. There's a Funko Pop of them all. And here's my thing, man. I really have a gripe with Funko and a gripe with Funko Pops. That doesn't mean that I don't have a few. I mean, are there any other companies making Tom Servo and Crow figures? Not the last time I checked. And these two figures actually represent what I think of as like quality outliers. They're higher on the quality list because they aren't subject to Funko facification. Crow's eyes actually kind of benefit from looking a little scary. Funko Pops are a base character in a very loose sense. All of them, even if they, like Tom, have no discernible face at all, have the same proportions. There's even a rounded rectangle shape priority as well, as you can see in Tom's squared off gumball head that's usually perfectly spherical. Funko Pops don't really benefit from the same exact manufacturing benefits of, say, the Lego minifigure. You're going to need to make new molds for each character. These are toys that are sculpted largely digitally in ZBrush as well. So what you are gaining is those similar proportions, the same size for boxes. Yes, I know there's big and jumbo-sized boxes, but you know how well these things stack together. You've been to a store. There's a process for making pops that is incredibly efficient, and the consumers of these pops are, I guess, glad that it's almost impossible to tell which human from a basketball team this figure is without looking at the jersey, or which character from The Office this is without looking at the hair or torso. Not only is every single human character's face the exact same, with the widely spaced, undynamic, and socketless eyes met with an uninspired triangular nose that's a vacuum for appeal, but not everything is above board with Funko themselves. Yes, they are successful, and collectors and casual fans do buy a lot of Funko Pops, driving up the demand. But there's something kind of fishy happening with the supply. Funko, as recently as recent, I'm not positive it's necessarily still the case, but it happened long enough to create a monopoly. They insisted that stores can't order individual figures, or really control how much they were ordering of Funko Pops at all. You just got a case of them. And if that case had only one of the hot new character from a movie, like your Baby Groot or your Morbius, and the rest of the case was just obscure losers and unpopular bummers, who cares? You were buying the whole case. You want 2 Baby Groots or 2 Morbiuses? Looks like you're buying 2 crates there, bucko. Target or GameStop bucko. And as quickly as they were shelved, obviously Baby Groot and Morbius were purchased, reasonably so, but the bummers and losers warmed the shelf because they aren't going anywhere. No one liked Morbius's dog, so more cases come in and the good ones get picked through and the shelves bloat and bloat with more and more shelf-warming figures. It's like if hot dogs were sold in packs of 2 and buns were sold in packs of 10, but you're only allowed to buy them at a 1-to-1 ratio. You're going to have 8 buns left over for every complete hot dog. So that's why the shelves are overflowing with endless rows of these uniform boxes. And yes, I'm adding a little flavor text of animosity here for entertainment. I have nothing against the individual artists or 3D sculptors or folks making a living, but I do have a little grievance with the way that this company has ended up choking out, I'd say, about 90% of the vinyl toy market, and a good part of the regular old toy market as well. It's not only Pops that Funko produces. The majority of IP-based blind boxes you'll find, even plushes, are made by Funko. Funko even has dabbled in their own IP and done pretty interesting stuff with it. I just think that it's a bit sad that what was once a thriving scene made up largely of independent artists creating varied and different works, based either in parody or in wholly original works, has shifted almost all the way towards being based off of franchises and existing IP. I don't hate those things for existing, I enjoy them for the large part, but it does feel a bit like the little fledgling scene was needlessly strong-armed, and you'd have kind of a hard time convincing me that Funko wasn't a really big part of the outcome. By the way, like I said, Kid Robot is still around. There's also a really cool Chinese company called Pop Mart making incredibly high quality blind box figures. But like I said, there is a ton of Disney or Marvel or DC intellectual property mixed into these things, and if that's what pays the bills, I get it. But it's also a little frustrating that we can't have more original and independent stuff. Hey, is that a segue? Well, I'm at least gonna try to make that a segue. Taking everything that we've learned from base characters, can we make one of our own? And with my respect to LEGO minifigures and Miis, I am not setting out to create a default, a universal standard that lies neutral in the middle. That would no doubt take a lot of iteration and testing and feedback. I kind of want to make instead something that harkens back to those urban vinyl days, a blank 3D shape that any artist can apply some 2D art to, that through its shapes informs something about what the artist has to do with it. My goal is to create a design, a 2D template that you can draw on for free, a 3D file you can have for free, and can I even successfully 3D print, mold, and cast a figure that you can have for the price it is. I can't replicate that endlessly like something digital. Can I do all that? Do I look kind of tired filming this after the fact? Let's find out. I started things off with some quick sketches to iterate on this idea, riffing on some of those existing base character influences while trying to make something of my own. What I ended up with was a bigger-headed little figure with a strong collar shape that I then started to mock up in Blender. Here I made sure that there were some strong lines in the character, along the head, around the mitt of the hand, and I finished it off with a somewhat signature Brookes Eggleston Biko-esque dollop of hair or whatever it is on the top of the character's head. I then brought literal screenshots of this 3D model back into Procreate, where I traced over them, I created a PSD with layered line art and color, and we christened this little character the Labco. You know, like collab, but reversed. This file I then sent out to some pro artist friends of mine, and it's also a file you can have completely for free in the link below, because I want this to be something that you can riff off of and create your own characters from as well. So more on that later, and more on what those artists sent back too. As you might know from last year, I successfully 3D printed and painted a Klonoa amiibo, which, by the way, the remakes of those came out this week. Please go support them so they can make more games. And I also 3D printed and painted
Jamborelas,
which was a ton of fun. For the Labco though, I want to attempt something that I've only dabbled in before, and that's to create a mold that we can cast copies from. I made a super high resolution file of the Labco and loaded it into Chitu Box to be printed on my frozen Mighty 4K printer. I had a weird sticking problem with my printer, so I stopped the print and restarted it with a lubricated screen. Then I followed all the steps you do with prints, scraped them off of the build plate. Oh hey, there's an old Klonoa and Jamborella. I bathed them in isopropyl, cured them with UV light, and sand and sand and sand and primer and sand to get them as smooth a surface as possible. So far, there is one big problem with this figure, and if you haven't already figured it out, it's that it has a massive head and tiny, indiscernible feet. The thing is, at this point, changing the initial design would mean throwing out what other artists have already made, so the Labco design is locked. The good thing is, though, that whatever goes into the mold comes out of the mold. So I grabbed this little plastic disc from an Oswald figure base, plugged the holes with clay, and stuck it to the bottom of the figure. It's a base character base. Hey. So in a frenzy earlier this year, in order to have gifts for a family reunion, I casted some Pez dispensers with white resin and then turned them into bottle stoppers with a copper patina finish. This was a copy of something existing and a single part of the mold. By the way, these were like the rejects that are like very off-center. Made it in a couple hours. For the Labco, I used modeling clay and modeling clay and modeling clay, and do you think I got enough? To build a negative for the first part of the mold, making sure to make places for registration keys so that the mold sticks back together. I also tried as hard as I could to get up to the edge of the figure to make it tight. I saved the silicone from last time to fill out some negative areas in the mold where it didn't matter, and then I let that sit. Then, taking the bottom off and the clay out, I repeated the process for the back of the figure. Once that's cured, I can cast with some liquid plastic resin that sets in about 15 minutes. There's flashing around the edges of the figure, but that's pretty easy to sand off.
Hold it, y'all. And hold it. We're going to hold it with the left after this.
Okay, that's great. That's awesome. The real problem at first here was the bubbles that led to the fingers and thumbs being incomplete. Those little gaps that are up so high on the waterline, so to speak, were a real problem area. I cut some vents into the mold where the fingers were, and after a few attempts, I had a nice, decent cast that I'm happy with. This is one kind of weird one where I didn't have the mold, tight enough, so material started leaking out the side, as you can see, and so therefore these kind of got like a translucent bottom there, kind of ghosting. So now with a good cast, I can sand, prime, and paint this figure. But I think I'm gonna leave painting them for another time, maybe another video if you're interested, because not only was this video already a ton of work, the goal wasn't to make something that I could customize, but something that you can customize. And I have to give a huge shout out to the awesome pro artists that I reached out to who were already laden with their own projects and work to make their own interpretations of the Labco on a really short turnaround. These look amazing. A gigantic thank you to Kevin, Mike, Teague, Lewis, Christina, AJ, and Gitmads, who I tagged along with their Labcos on screen here. And also a huge thank you also to everyone else that I asked who was like down with the idea, they just truly didn't have the time to do it. I completely understand that. That's me most of the time. These are amazing and honestly inspirational, and now it's your turn. So I'm making the JPEG, the Photoshop file, the Blender file, and the STL print file available open source to you for free on the link on the screen. And if you're interested in a physical Labco figure that I cast so that you can customize yourself in person, I'm setting up a pre-order in very limited quantities over on the brand new brookeseggleston.com/shop. Whatever you make with Labco, please share it with me, tag it with #Labco. I can't wait to see what you do with it. Maybe we can bring back our own little tiny version of that designer toy renaissance. Oh, how could I forget? The new Biko's backpack for July. We have the Fauna Warden Zonette's apprentice Kusa in a foil trading card that I'm really excited about, and an oversized Glangor hard enamel pin. We couldn't just make Glangor normal sized. Those are available over on patreon.com/bageldenizen. My course Learn Character Design is over 18 hours of a comprehensive character design curriculum at learncharacterdesign.com. Thank you so much for watching, and have fun creating your own Labco. I'm just kidding. If you want to, go do it. Check out the new brookeseggleston.com/shop. Thank you again, Tay. Love you. Peace. Fun fact, I made this entire video, like an hour of just straight up filming for what ends up being like a 30-minute video, with my mic this way. The mic was facing the wrong direction and it sounded echoey like this. Oh my